Welcome everyone. This is our June 2025 meeting. We're going to start with just some general information. I've got a couple of announcements to make, and then we'll turn it over to Dr. Willing and the Neuroscience of Transgenderism presentation. First of all, we are recording this meeting. I'm just saying that so you all know that. We post our meeting videos on our YouTube channel. Only the speaker's image, who the person is speaking, will be in the recorded video. So the rest of you, unless you say something, you won't appear in the video. When the presenter is sharing their screen like I'm doing right now, I recommend you choose the speaker view, and I've got the Zoom menu for that. You don't have to do that, but that just makes it fewer distractions for you. But that's just a tip there. Just briefly about us, we are a group of men and women from diverse age groups, backgrounds, and levels of education who are interested in scientific research and general evidence that point to God's existence, character, and the Bible's reliability. Our topics lean toward STEM areas of interest, but are not limited to these. There's our email address on the screen there, triangle-apologetics-community@outlook.com. If you want to get on the list, just send a note to that address and I will add you. Let me mention one other thing. We do have a YouTube channel, which we started a couple of months ago, maybe 3 months ago now. And so we post our meetings there, so you can see the last few meetings we've done, and we posted a few of the previous ones we recorded as an RTB chapter before they changed their chapter situation. So some of those are there as well. I wanted to highlight just a few things that are coming up. We have some interesting topics coming up over the next few months. In July, we're going to talk about ethical artificial intelligence. In August, wellness for the whole person, spirit, soul, and body. In September, psychological science and the life of the mind. And in October, is there scientific proof of the soul? I'll just mention that that one is also by a medical doctor who does a lot of neuroscience. So we're going to talk about neuroscience tonight. So that'll be an interesting one. And all of these, of course, start at 7:30 Eastern Time via Zoom. Now let's get into tonight's topic, the neuroscience of transgenderism. Stephen Willing is an MD and an MBA. What is transgenderism? This term is a very loaded one in our society today and stimulates much discussion and raises many questions. Is this a disease, a habit, an ideology, or something else? Does transgenderism have anything to do with biology? What is neuroscience? What does neuroscience have to do with transgenderism? What does the research show? How should neuroscience inform our understanding of transgenderism? So that's our topic for tonight. Let me introduce our speaker, Dr. Stephen Willing. He's board certified in diagnostic radiology and neuroradiology with an MD from Medical College of Georgia and an MBA from the University of Alabama at Birmingham. He has held faculty positions at the University of Louisville, the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and Indiana University, where he taught and practiced diagnostic and interventional neuroradiology. Currently, he's a clinical neuroradiologist at Children's of Alabama, a consultant in radiology at Tenwek Hospital in Kenya, and a visiting scholar with Reasons to Believe, and an adjunct professor of divinity at Regent University. Dr. Willing is the author of Superbia, The Perils of Pride, The Power of Humility. Just a couple things on the left side there. If you want to get more information, there's 2 links you can get a little bit more information about. The first one there is from reasons.org, and the second one is his own blog page called The Soggy Spaniel. All right, so let me stop my share here, and Stephen, you can take over.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that nice introduction. Thank you for letting me be here today. I have a lot to cover, and I'm going to try it and do it in just 30 minutes. So I'm going to make like Leah Thomas and just jump right in. What is transgenderism? This term is actually a lot more loaded than you might think. The suffix ism can describe a disease condition like autism or hypothyroidism, a habit or predilection like altruism or racism, or an ideology such as capitalism or Marxism. Now, some activists don't like that word transgenderism because it sounds like it's just an ideology, but a quick search of mine turned up over 28,000 scholarly papers that use this term, so I'm going to go with it. For the next 30 minutes, transgenderism simply means a state of being transgender, whatever that means. So, what does it mean? Most commonly, it describes an individual who identifies with a gender that does not correspond to their sex. Beyond that, we run quite suddenly into a series of contradictions and conundrums. What is gender? Nobody can agree on that. As reported last summer, a 5-year project funded by the EU was unable to agree on a definition despite over $4 million in funding. They quote, with teams from a variety of backgrounds, it was important to explore definitions of sex and gender in our discussions. What clearly emerged from the study pre-presentations and ensuing discussions was that sex and gender often interacted and were difficult to tease apart. Defining and documenting gender was found to be complex, challenging, and was approached in diverse ways in the funded studies. I would have been happy to give them a definition for half the amount that they spent on this project. Now, various claims are made by those in the category of advocates who call themselves gender affirming. One is that sex and gender are independent of one another or only loosely linked. But if sex and gender are different, then what is gender? There's no diagnostic test for it. It comes down to whatever the person claims for him or herself. But is it really ontologically possible to have a body of one sex and the mind of another? And if so, aren't you still defining gender in terms of sex? And how would one know that they feel like the opposite sex having never been there? Not being a woman, I could never know how it felt to have the mind of a woman. So in practice, this reduces to filtering one's personality and preferences through highly stereotypical views of masculinity and femininity. The implication seems to be that gender is a personal trait like extroversion or left-handedness, that it is innate, immutable, and independent of sex, except those things can be observed by another party. But if it's not sex, from what part of the mind or body does gender originate? Nobody can say. It's almost platonic, as if there were transcendental forms of male, female, and other in the realm of being that constitute the substance of a person, even if the accident is of the opposite sex, kind of like how transubstantiation works in the Catholic Eucharist. But if gender exists only in the mind of the perceiver, it is unfalsifiable. To believe it is to see, or is it? Maybe we can test that theory. Now, there are different interpretations of what it is. Within the population that we could describe as trans-affirming, there are at least three popular interpretations that are mostly contradictory. Number one, transgenderism is biologically based but dysfunctional. DSM stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and it serves as a reference for the categorization and diagnosis of mental illness. We're now in the 5th edition, which came out in 2013. This position that it's a mental illness actually would have been the consensus of almost the entire scientific community before the DSM-5, and it was called gender identity disorder. The manual changed in 2013, but that doesn't mean everybody's on board. The ones who still think of it as a mental illness may or may not support gender affirmation in young people. The second interpretation is that transgenderism is biologically based but merely a normal variant. The DSM-5 depathologized cross-sex gender identification, meaning it's no longer considered a disorder of any sort. For those who accept this framework, people really are the gender they identify as, whether they actually transition or not. This group also would totally support gender affirmation. But a third position, and very common, biology has little or nothing to do with it. It is socially constructed, pure and simple, and that's okay. This point of view is reflected more among philosophers like Michel Foucault and Judith Butler, but the ones in this camp also 100% support gender affirmation. Among the gender critical group, we also have different interpretations. Number one, it's a mental illness in the classic sense. Again, this was a mainstream position until 2013, except this group would tend not to support the so-called gender affirmation. Or number two, it's a delusion, just another example of someone passionately believing in something that doesn't correspond to reality. Number three, it's a social contagion where young people imitate those they admire in an effort to maintain acceptance or look cool. Or number four, it's a self-selected identity, a consequence of expressive individualism, as described by Charles Taylor. Carl Trueman in The Strange New World did a masterful job in explaining how this viewpoint emerges as a reigning paradigm, but it's not necessarily all-encompassing. And these explanations are not mutually exclusive, by the way. Most of these could be true in some cases, although the normal variant viewpoint doesn't really meld well with the other positions. On the other hand, I find it interesting that the last three gender critical explanations are perfectly consistent with it being a social construct. So we would differ only from Judith Butler and Michel Foucault, only in the sense of seeing it as a negative thing. And with so many different viewpoints, you can see where there might be so much heat and so little light. It's difficult to either prove or disprove something when nobody can agree on what it is. It's like nailing Jello to the wall. So how does neuroscience factor into this discussion? In several ways. First, those in the affirming community regularly trumpet the latest study claiming to prove that gender is both innate and independent of sex. By the way, that puts them in direct conflict with the social construct contingent. The Butler camp continues to deny that there are any sex-related differences in the brain and see gender as just the second verse of the same song. Second, these different hypotheses regarding transgenderism enable us to make predictions that can be tested. Third, an accumulated body of neuroscience was already well in place before transgenderism captured the global attention, and this early understanding can and should inform our thinking. Advocates may say that social and medical transitioning merely brings the body into line with the mind. But what if it goes the other way? What if the cart is pulling the horse, meaning gender affirmation changes the brain? I'm going to structure this in the form of four essential questions. First, what is neuroscience? Second, what does it have to do with transgenderism? Three, what does the research show? And four, how should neuroscience inform our understanding of transgenderism? In July of 1989, President George Bush signed a proclamation declaring the 1990s as the decade of the brain. And what emerged over the ensuing decade and continues to this day was an explosion of research into the human brain, how it forms, how it works, and how things go wrong. Neuroscience is a broad field that includes anatomy, biology, chemistry, psychology, sociology, and multiple medical specialties, including my own specialty of neuroradiology. Indeed, neuroscientists run the gamut from the lowly graduate students all the way to world-famous neurosurgeons, as pictured here. In the case of transgenderism, however, hardly any research had been done prior to the mid-2000s, mostly because it was rare. This chart indicates the number of neuroimaging studies that included transgender participants, ranging from 1 in 1991 to 83 in 2024. We have many different ways to study the brain. These include behavioral study and psychological testing, chemical analysis of hormones and neurotransmitters like testosterone and estrogen and dopamine, examination of brain structure by MRI in living people. This does what we call gross anatomy, which means you can see it without a microscope. We have functional imaging, particularly MRI. Brain regions that are active use more oxygen and demand more blood flow, so we can use MRI to look at changes in blood flow at rest or during particular brain tasks. Post-mortem analysis and brain dissection. For obvious reasons, this is less helpful in humans. And lastly, not all research has to use humans. We've learned vast amounts from the study of animal models. In the case of transgenderism, neuroscience can and has been used to elucidate differences in the brain in an attempt to explain it, to test hypotheses concerning its cause, and to possibly predict the outcome of interventions. I'd say at the outset, though, that even if research finds that transgender brains differ in certain respects, that doesn't narrow the range of possible explanations as much as you think. Finding changes in the brain wouldn't necessarily prove whether it was biologically based, a normal variant, or a mental illness. Setting aside for the moment all the disagreement over what transgender is, a popular version in public use boils down to the claim that one can have a male brain in a female body or a female brain with a male body. If there were a way to tell male brains from female brains, we then could look at the brains of transgender people and see if their brain matches their sex or their gender identity. So can we? As a matter of fact, the very idea that male and female brains might possibly be different was a matter of hot contention for quite some time. But over time, the evidence continued to pile up. Little boys and little girls differ in many ways. Almost every parent and teacher knows that. So there was always a good reason to think male and female brains were different. That would be the best explanation for consistent and reproducible differences in personality and behavior, seen not only in human children, but many higher primates. Many psychiatric and neurological disorders show a strong sex predilection, whether it be autism in males or Alzheimer's in females. Also, the obvious realization that men and women differ in their genetic makeup and experience different hormonal influences during critical periods of development. If there are differences between male and female brains, these could show up in different ways. Differences in visible structure could be explored in living subjects using high-resolution MRI. Differences in microstructure would require more precise microscopic analysis, meaning either post-mortem examinations or animal studies. Differences in the chemical environment via such modulators as hormones and neurotransmitters are less amenable to study by imaging. But differences in brain function can be explored using specialized MRI techniques that look at blood flow and brain activation using what we call functional MRI. So what do we know? What does neuroscience reveal so far about male and female brains? Well, simply looking at brain structure with MRI, subtle differences emerge that are detectable by computer analysis but imperceptible to the human eye. Brain size corresponds to body size, and because men are on average larger, male brains average about 9% larger than female brains. But female brains make up the difference with a higher density of neurons in the same volume of gray matter. Also, in women, the gray matter is a little thicker, whereas males have a higher percentage of white matter. Male brains show more interconnection within the hemispheres, whereas female brains show more connection between the hemispheres. But I'd emphasize that these are very subtle differences. If I've looked at MRI since it was invented, and it would be impossible for me to look at a scan and to make a guess as to whether that was a scan of a male or a female. These are things that can only be separated apart by extremely careful measurement and statistical analysis. With functional MRI that looks at active communication between various brain networks, researchers are now reporting extraordinary accuracy in distinguishing male from female brains and identifying which brains regions differ most greatly. The differences are bimodal, meaning two distinct peaks with a valley in the middle. The fat in the back of this Bactrian camel is bimodally distributed. Now, some male brains inevitably think of a more titillating example, but I'll stick with camels. Bimodal is really very different from a spectrum or a continuum, and these brain differences begin to develop in utero in response to circulating sex hormones. They're in place long before puberty. By the middle of the last decade, most neuroscientists considered the matter as settled. The entire January 2017 issue of the Journal of Neuroscience Research was dedicated to evidence for sex-based brain differences. In his introduction, journal editor Larry Cahill wrote, "The notion that sex matters fundamentally, powerfully, and pervasively for all of neuroscience, not just for reproduction, is an idea whose time has come." This has been effectively settled, but that doesn't mean there aren't still a lot of diehards who refuse to bow to the evidence, and almost all of them are in the Judith Butler camp. Since it's reasonably possible to tell whether a brain is more male or female based on sophisticated imaging techniques, it is possible to study transgender subjects and determine whether their brain corresponds closer to their sex or their gender identity. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to walk through a few studies from the last 4 years. The results are mixed, although the most recent studies indicate that transgender brains are much closer to their own sex than the opposite sex. The titles and the source are on the top if you want to check out the papers, but I won't read them at all. This study reported in, yeah, This study reported in 2020 used a machine algorithm to try and differentiate male and female brains based on structure, and then applied the rules to 26 trans women. These are people born male. In the transgender In the trans subjects, the discriminator was less accurate in predicting a male brain. In other words, the brains of trans women deviated a little from the average male brain and were a little more likely to be misclassified as female. They concluded it was somewhat of a wash, not your average male brain, but not female either. A quote from their conclusions: our results support the hypothesis that brain structure in trans women differ from brain structure of their biological sex as well as their perceived gender. So they weren't showing up as female brains, they were just showing slightly different than male brains. That same year, another group used functional MRI in a group of 92 subjects equally divided between men, women, and trans men, 26 in each group. This method basically looks at which regions of the brain are talking with each other. They applied a machine learning algorithm to try and separate the four groups, then retrospectively applied that technique to the same group of subjects, claiming the ability to predict better than mere chance. There were several flaws with this approach. The accuracy rate, though higher than pure chance, remained rather low. 25% would have been random. But what's worse is they applied their tool to the same set of patients used to develop the tool. That's a research equivalent of arguing in a circle. They should have used the rule and applied it to a set of unknown patients to see if they could accurately predict and lead to meaningful results. Another report 1 year later looked just at structural MRI with a group of 214 trans men, 172 trans women, 196 women, and 221 men. They claimed significant differences between cisgender and transgender subjects in the volumes of some regions of the brain. But rather than being merely shifted towards either end of the male-female spectrum, transgender persons seem to present with their own unique brain phenotype. What did they not find? They didn't find that trans men brains looked more male or the trans women brains looked more female. That same year, another group published a review of 39 studies reporting brain imaging in transgender subjects. They noted that these 39 projects were extremely heterogeneous, both in terms of their patient profiles and the techniques that were used. The authors acknowledged that almost all of the studies found some difference between transgender and cisgender subjects, but they still remained closer to their sex than their gender identity. Summarizing these 39 studies, our results suggest that some features in transgender individuals resemble those of their experienced gender, despite the majority resembling those from their natal sex. A newer and much larger study came from the Netherlands in 2023 using structural imaging in adolescents between ages 13 and 15. In this cross-sectional study of 2,165 adolescents from the Netherlands general population, no significant differences in total brain volumetric measures were observed between youths who reported gender diversity and youths who do not. The results did point to one possible area of difference, but only in those born boys. However, these findings further suggest that gender diversity in the general population correlates with specific brain morphological features in the inferior temporal gyrus among youths who are assigned male at birth. Some of these earlier studies didn't take head size into account, which would throw the findings off one way or another, since that's one of the most consistent differences between male and female brains. This 2023 report using structural imaging found that after taking the total intracranial volume into account, that the model was equally accurate in determining sex in both cis and trans subjects. In other words, their brains match their sex, not their gender identity. Bringing us into 2024, this study reported the results of functional MRI in 19 trans men, that's female to male. Because it's functional imaging, it has implications for cognition and behavior. And the researchers reported that contrary to the assumption that cognitive function in trans individuals aligns more closely with their gender identity counterpart, Our findings suggest a similar cognitive profile between trans men and cisgender women, so their brains match their sex, not their gender identity. This last paper appeared in mid-2024 and made a small splash. The researchers examined a data set of thousands of children ages 9 to 20 and used functional MRI first to look for correlations with their sex and then to look for correlations with gender identity. Of course, there is no test for gender identity, so they asked the children a few questions and asked their parents about play behavior. They claim that the research supported the idea that sex and gender correlate with different brain regions and thus could be different things. This is what they found. Certain brain regions were correlated with sex, but gender was more distributed throughout the cerebral cortex. Sex and gender were strongly correlated. Well, that's obvious because almost all boys identify as boys, almost all girls are feminine. So you could predicting a gender was simple if you just used sex as a criterion. However, their ability to predict gender apart from sex was far less accurate. So in other words, if they looked at the brain of a boy, they could not predict, and that boy was maybe transgender, which is problematic to make that assessment. They could not predict it from the model. My critique of this would be that the deck was stacked the moment they defined gender. If you define gender in terms unrelated to biological sex, that's likely what you're going to find that is not related. Finally, a major shortcoming of all these studies is that they don't attempt to distinguish between early and late onset cases, and some were entirely done on adults. They may not even be relevant to adolescent onset cases, which many of us believe should be in a category of their own. Since there's no diagnostic test for transgender, we really can't know if all of the transgender subjects were trans, nor whether all the control subjects were not. It's really hard to study something that you can't define and can't objectively determine. Summing up these recent reports, we can infer that in some respects, a transgender brain could be less masculinized in a male or less feminized in a male, but this is true of many who are not trans. Male and female brains differ, and the differences are in a bimodal distribution with some overlap. We've known for decades that the differences between boys and girls are population-wide and don't apply to every single child. Some girls are tomboys and some little boys are bookish. That can be called gender atypia or gender nonconformity. It's totally normal, and we see evidence of it reflected in those studies showing male and female brain patterns spread out along those curves. One thing on which almost everyone agrees is that gender is a matter of personal identification. While identity formation is also something that has been closely studied, research has found that personal identity is linked to an area of the brain called the medial prefrontal cortex, which is itself a part of the default mode network. This network is the one engaged in self-awareness, self-reflection, and daydreaming. So if being transgender is a matter of identity, of course it wouldn't be related to sex different regions. It's exactly what anyone would predict. Regions of the brain that differ between sex are not related to regions of the brain associated with identity formation. Therefore, it's completely plausible that gender identity can conflict with sex. Furthermore, identity formation is heavily influenced by social factors. This can be why Lisa Littman and Abigail Schreier found that many adolescent and pre-adolescent girls were being shaped by social media. So in conclusion, what does transgenderism look like through the lens of neuroscience? First, there is no evidence so far that a person of one sex can have a brain of the opposite sex. Even the studies that found a difference found a very small one, and the subjects remain closer to their sex than their preferred gender. Second, be skeptical of all claims that imaging studies prove there is a transgender brain. Many earlier studies have been undermined by later research, and until someone can actually define gender and test for it, I don't see how it could ever be proved. Third, identity and sex involve different regions of the brain, so it's possible for them to diverge. That doesn't prove that it's healthy or normal. Lastly, be wary that gender affirming care is really gender confirming care. What do we mean by that? The adult human brain is determined by a lot of factors beyond our genes. The brain is adaptable, a child's brain much more so, and its growth is modulated by genetics, the hormonal environment, and social factors. Puberty is a critical window in brain development that's dependent upon sex hormones, and this is not something you want to be messing with. So far, there is little data on the long-term effects of puberty blockers in children, but what has been reported so far gives us cause for concern, like measurable declines in IQ. We can prove in the lab that puberty blockers cause permanent and irreversible changes in brain development in animal models. To assume it wouldn't happen in humans is dangerously naive. It is well established that the majority of children with gender dysphoria literally grow out of it, called desist, turning into adults who are at peace with their sex body. But in the Tavistock series from the UK, the desistance rate after puberty blockers dropped from around 85% to a shocking 2%. Well, why is this bad? Among many reasons, it can lead to permanent sterility, sexual dysfunction, and a lifetime on medication. And according to everything we know about child development, even social transitioning is self-reinforcing. Those seemingly harmless little things like changing names and pronouns have a direct influence on the developing brain. So in conclusion, let me leave you with these. The evidence so far confirms that the brains of trans individuals remain much more similar to their sex than their gender identity. For advocates of gender affirmation, the state of mind may direct treatment, but treatment affects the mind as well. The arrow of causality goes both ways. Next, this is a biggie that gets to what I think is the heart of the matter. To be gender atypical is a feature of our created diversity. It's not a disease or a dilemma to resolve. Next, be suspicious. Many extravagant claims will be made, but also be humble. Denigrating science or scientists reflects poorly upon us. Next, don't be defensive. A sound viewpoint does not exclude the possibility of brain alterations. Um, And lastly, any brain findings related to transgenderism cannot establish whether it is good, normal, or healthy. This is Hume's law. You cannot derive an ought from an is. Science can describe, but it cannot prescribe. It can tell us how things are, but it cannot tell us how things ought to be. So any studies, any data, any evidence that might emerge in the next 1, 5, 10, or 20 years about the transgender brain never establishes whether it's good or bad for the individual. I will stop there and open it to questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Willing. That was great. Very fast tour. So who's got questions? Either raise your hand or just unmute yourself and let's open it up for questions.
Could be an early night for me.
Everybody's taking notes so fast, they're still trying to catch up.
Essentially, complete text of this is on my website at swilling.com.
Okay, good. And that was one I showed in the when I introduced him. But yeah, we can put that back up. I do want to ask a question. This is kind of a starter question. So where are we with definition of gender? Are we getting anywhere at all? Because I know some people are trying to say it's this thing that's completely different. Um, like you said earlier, in the perception of the owner or the mind. Um, is there any traction in any direction on that?
You're never going to get people to come to an agreement on that. Um, for most of us who would, be in the so-called gender critical camp, we think there's kind of two ways to handle it. When we say sex and gender are the same and they match, and this is a tempest in a teapot or a made up issue. The second is okay, we'll concede to them that gender is something that exists completely in the mind of the individual. It's something that's socially constructed. Um, I can explain. Not everybody understands is facile with the term social construct, but social construct basically means it's not rooted in nature. It's made up by man. So, you know, I am a male. I'm 5'8". I have brown hair, blue eyes. I'm an introvert. These are things that are innate. But I'm an American. That doesn't come by nature. It's just because I was born in uh, a country that was created by human beings called the United States of America. So being American is a social construct. Um, and when you, so if you're going to say, transgender, what is gender? You're starting, if you, once you step beyond the sex binary, once you step beyond male and female, you're just making things up. That doesn't mean they're wrong. I mean, it doesn't end the debate. I mean, anytime we're talking about abstractions where they're talking about human rights or natural law, I mean, you can say they're all socially constructed. Now, that's not a part of our epistemology. We think that things are also revealed, and so there are other ways of getting truth. But I mean, say you could certainly argue that the Federalist Papers are all socially constructed. Okay, so social construct. So what? Long way circle back. What is gender? Whether if you look at Butler and what they're saying, it's just wherever one's imagination leads them. That's essentially what it is. Because it's not rooted in biology, it's not rooted in nature. It's however they want to construct it. Hence the term social construction. And you might think that, and you don't really see the conflict, but you would think they would be fighting with each other over this interpretation because there's certainly a contingent is adamant that no, you're born that way and it's determined, it's innate and it's immutable. And that's a complete opposite. It's absolutely incompatible with the positions of the Butler camp. Uh, Yet they're both alive and active within the trans affirming community.
Hmm. Go ahead.
Hey, Ray.
Yeah, I haven't read much about this subject, but some of the things I read say there's a lot of money in gender affirming activities. Where's it all coming from, or is anybody tracing who's really pushing all this?
I have to chuckle because that's part of, I kind of incorporated that into my talk at RTB next week. It's going to be introducing two characters, and one of them is okay, just it's all about the money. Show me the money. Uh, and it's kind of interesting. I don't, the short to that is people are motivated by a lot of things beside money. Pure approval, pride, ego, power. A lot of things besides money, and you don't probably not driven by money. Although, yes, there are incentives. You can look at somebody like Johanna Olson Kennedy, who's one of the major advocates of it in this country and the leader of the project at UCLA. These people get research funding from the NIH, which regretfully was granted. They get paid by attorneys for appearing as expert witnesses. They get paid sometimes for media appearances. So individuals, probably some healthcare systems are getting money from the services running from hospital admissions, from surgical charges, that sort of thing. What's a lot less plausible is that pharmaceutical companies are making any money off of it for one simple reason. These are off-label use of medications, and it's a tiny, tiny number, really, of kids who are getting these puberty blockers. But that's an important concept. This matter of FDA approval or off-label use. Whenever a new drug is introduced, it has to prove safety and it has to prove efficacy, and the efficacy and safety have to be provided through 3 phases of prospective clinical trials. And only then does it get approved by the FDA, and only then does it and when it gets approved, doesn't get approved. Okay, you can use it for wherever I mean, you have to say, okay, I have a miracle drug and it's going to be for rheumatoid arthritis. I'm going to test it. And then it's okay, well, we'll approve your miracle drug and it's approved for rheumatoid arthritis and you can therefore market it and advertise it and promote it for treatment of rheumatoid arthritis, but you cannot market it for anything else or you'll be subject to fines and legal sanctions. So what follows from that is I am unaware of anything, any instance in medical practice anywhere in this country where the so-called standard of care requires the off-label use of a medication. Yet this is exactly what they're doing with puberty blockers in kids. That is off-label use, and yet some of them have the chutzpah to claim that this is standard of care. Those two things are incompatible. The same then applies to one's next step after puberty blockers would be to put little girls on testosterone or little boys on estrogen. Again, those are FDA approved drugs, but they are not approved for that indication. They're off-label use. So individuals are probably making money off of it. Hospital systems, pharmaceutical companies, probably not. Trial lawyers, trial lawyers may be making a lot of money off of it in the coming years. We'll see about that. I
Great.
love that question, obviously, because I find it so fascinating.
Yeah, the idea of follow the money is often a good one. I have two questions that I've been given. So let me ask the first one, and then after that we can talk about the second one. Um, does attending public school put children at risk, or perhaps greater risk, to have gender dysphoria?
Hmm. That has never appeared as a risk factor in anything that I've seen to date. Um, you know, there's probably a long list of risk factors, including just kind of when the kid's born, where they're going to land on that bimodal distribution, whether they're going to be a more masculine girl or a more feminine boy. So maybe some genetics, maybe early childhood influences. Um, I'm absolutely convinced that social media and cultural inputs are having a huge impact on it right now, as well as their own influence of their own peer group. And we also know that major risk factors are life traumas if they're orphaned or if they're in foster care or if they've been taken out of a family because of abuse or if they have uh, there's autism rate was extremely high in the Tavistock series. So if they have pre-existing mental illness, all these are risk factors, but school attendance, I don't think has ever been fingered as a risk factor. Although, you have is maybe secondarily if they're going to a school where there is a large peer group that's already into it, but it wouldn't be because they're going to public school. It's because they're going to be surrounded by kids who are into that.
Hmm. Okay. And my second question, you kind of touched on it a little bit, but let me ask the question. Is there a higher instance of gender dysphoria in those that are on the spectrum or neurodivergent, the autism spectrum?
That's really definitely emerged. The the likelihood of autism spectrum is 20, 30 times higher in the transgender. This would be now we're just talking about the adolescents mostly who are presenting, not the ones who are presenting in early childhood or the ones, the Rachel Levines and Caitlyn Jenners who do it in adulthood. Um, but in the ones who are presenting in late childhood, early adolescence, it's much, much higher. Um, I want to say as high as 40% in one, but I don't have the papers in front of me and I can't remember all those numbers.
Okay, super. Thank you. Anybody else? Well, I will mention just as a reminder, we are recording this video and we'll put it up on our YouTube channel. So if you don't think of questions now, you can rewatch the video and look at all the links and the studies. And um, maybe if I can offer this, Dr. Willing, if someone wants to send me the question, I can forward it to you and maybe we can correspond by email or something.
Okay, and next Saturday, Reasons to Believe is having this symposium. I think you can register for free via Zoom. I'm not sure who they send the invitation out to, but it'll be me and Kevin Birdwell and George Haraxon and Mark Perez, and I'll be talking about approaching the issue from a Christian mindset. So in my book, I talk about the 8 principles of Christian thinking, 8 principles of the Christian mind, and how you take these principles and take it, could apply it to this subject, but kind of in a way that you could take these same principles and apply it to any controversial subjects. And it'll be the way I'll be doing is approaching it through the minds of, two radically opposed individuals, because just being, what I think is the right side of this doesn't mean you can't err in the opposite direction. It's going to be largely derived from C.S. Lewis's statement in the Mere Christianity. He said the devil always sends his errors into the world in pairs of opposites, and he counts on your extra dislike of one to draw you gradually into the other. So should be fun.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions, I'll just thank everyone for joining. Thanks, Dr. Willing, for giving us this presentation. And look for this video to be on our website in the next day or two. And let's close with a word of prayer. Father, thanks that uh, you've given us minds to think through these kinds of issues. We have data that we can study and assess to see if these things are verifiable or falsifiable. Thanks for the principles of scientific observation that you've endowed us with. And thanks for Dr. Willing and his collection of all this data. Uh, we ask that we would proceed humbly, but and yet more informed than we were before tonight. We pray in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you. Good night,
All right.
everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.